Well, I want to thank you all for coming to learn about strategic doing. This is the first part of a four-part series where we're going to learn about strategic doing and how we can build collaborations quickly in our communities and our regions. I also want to thank the folks that are listening on the internet, because part of our message here is that this is a set of skills that we can all learn and share, and at Purdue we're producing these videos in order for everyone to understand the new way of thinking about collaboration in our communities and our regions. Today we're going to go over several key topics. One is our grandfather's economy and the role hierarchies played in building wealth in our grandfather's economy. We're going to look at our grandchildren's economy that's emerging, and that's emerging around networks. And we're going to focus on new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, and new ways of doing. But before we start, I wanted to share with you a story of about 15 years ago. I was in a rural county along the Ohio River in Kentucky. And I was hired as the consultant, as the expert to come in and come up with a strategy for how this county could build a new foundation for prosperity. And so you can imagine the scene. We had about 30 or 40 people coming into the community center. The sheriff walked in, and he was kind of quiet, very, didn't say much, kind of looked at his shoes a lot, and I thought that was sort of odd. But I found out later that the mayor and the chief executive of the county judge, were also in the audience, and they didn't talk to one another because they hated each other. So they sat on opposite sides, and they never interacted. The school principal came in, and she was vocal. She was talking about the problems of her school and the problems of the fact that her school was failing, and the community didn't seem to care that much about the fact that third graders weren't being able to read very well. And so how are we going to build an economy without kids that can read and comprehend well? We had one other real challenge, and that was the plant manager for the shoe factory came in, and it turned out the shoe factory had just closed down about a month earlier. And there were 200 workers. He was very excited about the workers. He said these were great workers. His big problem was they didn't have the literacy skills to get jobs in the new employers coming into the regional industrial park, and he didn't know what to do about that. Turns out that the sheriff wasn't concerned about any of this. He was concerned about the fact that the community was not dealing with what he saw as a critical issue, which is methamphetamines all over the county. Nobody wanted to talk about it. They did want to talk about the closing of the high school. And so we started talking a little bit about the closing of the high school, and of course I asked the question, well, when did the high school close? And they said 1965. So that was 30 years earlier. So I realized that this was a community with a lot of challenges, and I got up and I was going to make a presentation, and I realized I don't know what to do. It was overwhelming. And I got up and I realized I don't know what to do, and I confessed to my clients, I have no idea what we're going to do. And it was at that point that I hit the wall, that I realized that the old way of thinking, for me, didn't work anymore, and that I had to come up with something new. And that challenge of coming up with something new is what strategic doing is all about. It's how do we start to think about the challenges of this rural county, because we're all facing overwhelming challenges. So when I started to think about that, I realized that where is our economy? How do we get here? And we recognized that our economy is actually built on our grandfather's investments. Our grandfather created a lot of the wealth in our communities. In rural Kentucky, it's built on coal, right? Coal. In Cleveland, where I grew up, it's built on steel. Detroit was built on automobiles. Well, this was our grandfather's economy. And our grandfather's economy, kind of like every growing organic thing, essentially becomes a challenge of how do we build wealth using hierarchies. And we built a lot of hierarchy in our communities. But that hierarchy is starting to break down. And so what we have now are people running around trying to do the best they can with the broken hierarchies in our communities. And they're reaching all sorts of conflict and disorganization and confusion. And that's really what we see when we go into these communities. Go back into my county in Kentucky. I mean, everybody was trying to do the best they could, but they weren't talking to one another. They were conflicted with each other, right? Well, they were operating off of our grandfather's economy. And our grandfather's economy actually started in about the 1870s with the railroads. And by about the 1980s, we had started to peak. We had started to peak out. In Cleveland, where I grew up, the steel mills started closing down in the late 70s. In Youngstown, the late 70s. And so part of this challenge was, how do we build and understand the nature of our economy? And it's all around hierarchies. So what is a hierarchy? Well, of course, a hierarchy, we're all familiar with it because we've all been there. We've all seen hierarchies operate. We all operate in hierarchies to a certain extent. The nature of a hierarchy is defining different roles for people and putting them in those roles and keeping them stable. And so the hierarchy is really designed for stability. It's really designed for us to actually accomplish complex tasks in a very stable environment. And it's organized around the fact that the folks at the top do the thinking and the folks at the bottom do the doing. So a hierarchy works when we have people thinking from the top, doing from the bottom, and holding it all together is command and control. Rules, command and control, is a command and control structure that works. Well, the challenge, of course, is that we're operating in an environment where those hierarchies are starting to break down. They're starting to break down, and so our challenge is now, how do we start to think about a new economy that might be emerging? And this is where our grandchildren's economy is starting to come out and create a new pattern of wealth in our communities. It's around networks. It's around the idea that networks can create new prosperity. And so part of our challenge is understanding what a network is and how it operates. So let's go and start to think about a network. Usually a network organizes itself around a hub, and then there are links in that network. And those linkages create the relationships. So if we can figure out how to manage a network around those hubs and those links, then maybe we can intentionally create new prosperity in our communities. Maybe then we can solve the complex challenges that that county was facing, right? So the idea of building networks becomes central to strategic doing, because it's through those networks that we start to understand, how do these networks operate? Well, they operate differently than hierarchies. In networks, everybody is involved in thinking, and everybody is involved in doing. And what ties this network together is not command and control, because nobody can tell anybody what to do, but what ties it together is trust. So building these trusted networks, how do we build these trusted networks? That's the challenge. And we're now in the midst of this transformation between our grandfather's economy and our grandchildren's economy. And we all know this because we've seen the 6-year-old picks up the iPhone and starts thumb typing. That's our grandchildren's economy. And we all understand what happens when our grandfather's economy starts to collapse. So part of our challenge is figuring out, how do we make this migration, move this, our assets, our opportunities? How do we find those opportunities using our assets? Because what happens if we don't is, here's our grandfather's economy. Again, we're here, we're in the middle of this transition. This transition started in the 1970s, 1980s, and it's going to continue for another, 15, 20 years. And these assets are starting to fall off of our grandfather's economy, and we've got new networks forming down here in our grandchildren's economy. And our challenge is, how do we migrate these assets to new networks? How do we move them to new networks? Because if we don't move them to new networks, they fall apart. They deteriorate. So our challenge is building these new networks, taking the assets from our grandfather's economy, which are rich: libraries, universities, colleges, all of our cultural institutions, figuring out how to connect all those things together. How do our libraries connect to our universities? How do our universities connect to our employers? All of those kinds of connections need to be made, and we've got to figure this out because we're going to be moving in this direction. We're going to essentially trying to find new ways of doing that. Well, it turns out that the old way of thinking about strategy, how we do this, is going to be different. We need to find this alignment. We need to figure out how to do this alignment. In the old way of thinking, remember me back there on the stage, I was the thinker. And I was going to tell them what to do. So it was going to look like that. I was going to spend 6 months trying to figure out what they could do, and then I was going to give them what they could do, and they were going to go do it. Well, that didn't work, doesn't work. And so our challenge is, again, starting to figure out, how do we start to think and do in an organized way where we're essentially creating this alignment and the alignment and the connections and the trusted networks. And the point of strategic doing is, this does not have to be by accident. This can be intentional. We can manage this. We can guide these networks. And so we can do this with strategic doing. A discipline that we all can share, that we all can learn. So let's go back and review what we've done today. We've talked about our grandfather's economy and the role hierarchies play. We all came in to our economy thinking about hierarchies. We operated in hierarchies. That's how we organized our world. And they worked, and they started until about the 1970s, 1980s, they started to break down. And this is what was happening in this community. The hierarchies were breaking down. They were being overwhelmed by problems. The sheriff couldn't solve that problem. The school teacher couldn't solve her problem. She couldn't solve it within her hierarchy. And so they went and got a consultant, and I had to admit, I can't solve it either. I can't come up with the solutions for you. I can't do that. So we started thinking about, well, what's the nature of what's really going on here? Our grandchildren's economy is emerging. And we've seen that. We've seen the networks that are starting to emerge. And so the way in which wealth is being created is different. The way in which we're going to solve our problems is going to be different. The way in which we're going to find new opportunities is going to be different. And it's going to be around the idea of networks. It's going to be around, how do we guide and design these networks? Point is that we can do this intentionally rather than have this done serendipitously or just by accident. No, we can design this, but it's going to require us to think and do in a different way. We're not going to hire the only outside expert who's going to come in, or the top-down folks who are going to come in and teach everybody what to do. We're going to have to take ownership of our thinking and doing ourselves, and we're going to have to follow a discipline to do that. But as we do that, we gain alignments. And these alignments and these linkages, linking and leveraging these assets, enable us to do more with less. They enable us to find these new opportunities. And so we're essentially making the accelerated move up our grandchildren's economy by figuring out, how do I link and leverage all of these assets that our grandfathers have left us? So our challenge for everyone is, do you stay on the grandfather's economy curve? Hold on. Pretend nothing's going to happen? Everything will get better? Or do you say, no, this is a big transformation. We're going to move toward networks. We're going to start moving in a new and different way. We're going to cross those organizational and political boundaries in order to build new prosperity for our communities. In order to do that, we have to develop new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, and new ways of doing. And the remaining 3 modules here, sessions, are really going to focus in on these 3 issues of new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, and new ways of doing. Thank you.